Hello. For the topic of this video, we're going to do a brief introduction to an overview of the different ethical theories that we'll be looking at over the course of the next few weeks. I do this because I want us to be able to see these sort of a brief overview, a high-level view of how these theories are related to each other. That will help us, I think, to remember something about them, remember what they are, and as we continue on in our study, it'll be easier to sort of reference in our mind what they are. So here's the thing. I'll put some slides on here, and I would suggest looking at those slides, taking very good notes about this short sort of topic in general, and make sure that you memorize those notes. If you do that, if you memorize this little quote-unquote roadmap that I give you for this, I think you'll have a much easier time remembering what each theory is in relationship to the others, and so forth, come the final exam time. And then also just in categorizing which ones that you like and that sort of thing. So anyway, what I'm going to do is attempt to do a brief overview of these ethical theories and put them in relationship to one another. And the first question that sort of divides the entire field of ethics, at least is one way in which you can divide it, is this: do universal moral principles exist? Do universal moral principles exist? Now, when we talk about universal moral principles, what is meant by that are principles, moral principles that apply to every person, every moral being, throughout the span of all of history, either in the past or in the future, extending over every culture, extending over every language group, people of every time, and so forth. So are there universal principles that exist that apply to everyone? Now, this isn't asking if the people everywhere have recognized those universal moral principles. And it's certainly not asking if everybody across the span of history has obeyed those moral principles. What it's asking, because it readily recognizes, I think any of us recognize that moral rules and laws, whether they're objective or subjective, can be broken. So what the question is simply asking is that is there any moral principle that extends over everybody, that is universal in its scope, that has applied to everyone, whether they've obeyed it or not in the past? They don't have to even recognize it as a moral principle, as a valid moral principle. They don't have to obey it, but it does apply to them nonetheless. It's kind of like if I'm driving down the street and I don't know what the speed limit is, and I'm doing 50 miles an hour and the speed limit happens to be 35, regardless of whether I know it or not, know what the speed limit is, and regardless of whether I am obeying it or not, that speed limit still applies to me. That would be a legal principle that would apply to me. Well, there are some who say that moral principles are the same thing. There are people and cultures across the scope of history that have not recognized those moral principles, that have not obeyed those moral principles, and yet those moral principles are still binding on them. So that's the question. The first question is, do universal moral principles exist? If you say no to that question, if you answer no, then you're going to end up, basically that's going to put you to the side of the road where you're into subjective ethics. If you say that there's no such thing as a universal moral principle, all that exists are people's opinion about right and wrong, or cultures, a society's individual opinion about right or wrong, that morals and ethics are simply conventional. They're only instrumentally good. They're a means to an end to help society function better, or something like that. If that's all that morals are, then you're on the subjective ethics side of things. Subjective ethics, there are a couple of different versions of those that we'll look at in just a moment. But if you say that there's at least one universal moral principle, and I want to stress this though, there's at least one, meaning that all the rest of the moral principles could be subjective. But if you say that there's at least one, and that one will vary from theory to theory, what that one is, then you're going to end up on the side of a universal or an objective morality or an objective ethic. So if you say no, there's no such thing as universal moral principles, you're on the subjective side. You are espousing a form of relativism. If you say yes, there are universal moral principles, you're on the side of objective ethics, and there are many different theories there, and we'll look at those in turn. So that's the first major division of the ethical theories that we have. Now, if we go over to the subjective side, there are two forms that we will look at, and they're both forms of relativism. The first form of relativism is what we might call subjective ethical relativism. Subjective ethical relativism. It's also known as individual relativism. And basically what this view says is that moral principles are simply a matter of personal opinion. That there's nothing more or less than that. Morals, ethics, this sort of thing, they're just simply a matter of personal opinion. You have your opinion of right and wrong, and that's what's right for you and wrong for you. I have my opinion of right and wrong, and that's what's right for me and wrong for me. That's subjective ethical relativism, also known as individual relativism. The other form of relativism that we'll look at is that of, it's known as conventional ethical relativism, or it's also sometimes known as cultural relativism. Conventional ethical relativism or cultural relativism. And this view says that morals are a matter of what society says. Basically, it stresses the point that you and I learned our morals from a cultural context. And every individual culture has their own idea of right and wrong. And so if you want to know whether or not an act is moral, you have to ask what's the context in which this is taking place. Because there are some things that would be moral to do, let's say in the United States of America, that may not be moral to do in places, let's say like North Korea. There are two different cultures. They're separated by language, by place and geography, by government policies, and just different cultures altogether. And so, whereas, let's say, for example, speaking out against a government decision might be seen as good in the United States, and in fact, some cases might be seen as very moral to do. In North Korea, that's a very bad thing to do. They have a different view of things over there, and so in their culture, that would be a bad thing to do. That would be immoral. So conventional ethical relativism says that morals will vary from culture to culture. Each culture has its own approach to right and wrong, and whether an act is right or wrong is basically dependent upon the culture in which that takes place. We'll see that in another video. Well, those are the two different forms of relativism that we'll look at. Subjective ethical relativism, also known as individual relativism, and conventional ethical relativism, also known as cultural relativism. Both of those views are in agreement that there's no such thing as a universal moral principle. So that's the subjective ethics side of the equation. Now, on the other side, if you answer yes, that there are such things as universal moral principles, at least one, if you say to yourself that not all moral principles are relative, because you can believe in some relativism, but if you believe that there's at least one universal moral principle, you're going to end up on the side of the ledger that puts you in the objective ethics camp. And there are various views in the objective ethics camp that we'll look at as well. In fact, there are enough views that we're going to break them down into categories. Excuse me. So the first category of objective ethics that we'll look at are what is known as consequentialist ethics. And there are two different views under this sort of subcategory. Consequentialist ethics are ethical systems that judge the moral worth of an act based on the consequences that act produces. These are systems that judge the moral worth of an act based on the consequences that the act produces. Consequentialist ethics. And the two views that we will look at under consequentialist ethics are the first one will be egoism, which is a view that says that the right thing to do is basically to do whatever act promotes your own self-interest. That's known as egoism. Do whatever act promotes your self-interest. That's what good is. Now notice the universal moral principle then for egoism is do whatever results in your own best interest. Whatever action has the consequence of your own best interest, that's what you should do. That's egoism. It's a consequentialist ethic. Now notice there's only one universal moral principle there, right? Do whatever results in your own best interest. That's the moral principle that, according to egoism, everybody, every moral creature anywhere should obey. Now, there's all kinds of relative principles underneath that. So you ask yourself, is lying wrong? Well, does lying in this particular context promote your self-interest or not? If it does, then it's possible that lying is an acceptable thing to do. Whereas in other contexts, lying might produce bad consequences and therefore it might not promote your self-interest, therefore may not be the best thing for you to do. So everything is judged on the basis of the one universal moral principle that says everyone ought to act in their own self-interest. That's egoism. Now, another form of consequentialist ethic that we'll look at is utilitarianism. And utilitarianism says that everyone should always do whatever promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. You should always do what promotes the greatest good for the greatest number because that is the right thing to do. Again, it's judging the moral value of the action based on the consequence or the effect that the act produces. It's a consequentialist ethic, and it's just saying in the one universal moral principle of utilitarianism is that everyone, you, I, everyone else, should act in such a way so as to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. It's calling upon us to act for the greater good. That's the overarching moral principle, the one universal moral principle against which all other actions are judged. We'll look more into these in more depth later on. I'm just trying to get a high overview of them. So under objective ethics, so far we have consequentialist ethics, egoism, and utilitarianism. The second category of objective ethics that we'll see in this during this semester are those known as deontological ethics. Deontological ethics. In deontological ethics are ethical systems that are duty-based. In other words, there's an emphasis in deontological ethics on one's obligation. We're not going to be judging it on the basis of the result or the consequence produced by the action. We're going to try to tell which actions are good. What does the moral law require of us to begin with? Now, both forms, we'll look at two different forms of deontological ethics. One of them is intuitionism. The other one is known as Kantian ethics. And what we'll see is the difference between these two is how you find out what the moral duty is. You see, deontological ethics try to seek out what the requirements of the moral law are. Deontological ethics believes that the universe that we live in is a moral place. It's almost as if, in addition to like natural laws of gravity, laws of electromagnetism, things like this, in addition to those natural laws, deontological ethics believes also that the universe is a moral place, in that the universe makes moral requirements of us. And it's our duty to understand what those moral requirements are and then act accordingly. Kantian ethics, this is a system that says that in order to find out what the moral nature of the universe requires of us, what our obligations are, we need to find that out by using reason. We need to take a rationalistic approach to understanding what the moral nature of the universe is, and Immanuel Kant is very confident that we can do that. On the other hand, another branch of deontological ethics that we'll look at is known as intuitionism, and as you may be able to conclude from the name intuitionism. Intuitionism believes that we are able to read the moral nature of the universe based on a sensory perception that they call your intuition. Your intuition will read the moral nature of the universe, and you'll be able to understand what it is and then act accordingly. So intuitionism and Kantian ethics are both forms of deontological or duty-based ethics. The word deontological Where we get that from is the Greek word that deon, which literally means one's duty or obligation. So again, deontological ethics are forms of ethical systems that promote one's duty or obligation. So we've looked at consequentialist ethics of egoism, utilitarianism. We've looked at deontological ethics, Kantian ethics, and intuitionism. And the last category of ethics that we'll look at is that of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is sort of a category in and of itself. Virtue ethics is a kind of a broad-ranging category, but it takes a different approach on morality than either consequentialist or deontological do. So the difference is this, is that whereas both of those, consequentialist and deontological ethics, stress trying to find out what the moral law requires or what action is moral, virtue ethics, instead of asking what act is moral, they're going to, all the different forms of virtue ethics are going to concentrate on character development, the development of virtuous qualities in a person. And so it's not so much interested in trying to determine, okay, is this act going to be the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? Or is this act going to be the right thing to do or wrong thing to do? Instead, it says, look, what kind of person ought you to be? What kind of character qualities ought you to develop? Because if you, instead of asking what the actions are that you can do, if you were to develop your character, your actions will be from the overflow or from the outflow of your character. And if you focus on your character, then your actions will just kind of fall in line. They'll just follow, and you'll be able to do good things because you're a good person, you're a virtuous person. So virtue ethics are those forms of ethical systems that place the emphasis on character development more than they do on the proper action in a specific circumstance. Now, virtue ethics, I say that they're so wide-ranging because there are different forms of virtue ethics. We'll look at Aristotle's version of virtue ethics, but you could go in the Western context and there are Christian virtue ethics. You could go in the Eastern context and you've got Confucianism, which is a form of virtue ethics. And so there are various approaches to virtue ethics and development of virtues. But we'll look at them sort of in an umbrella fashion. We'll look at Aristotle in particular, but understand that virtue ethics is sort of an umbrella catch-all for those systems that emphasize character development. So that's really where we're going to go. We will probably say something also about feminist ethics, although what I typically find is that feminist ethics is sort of a thing where they are stressing that as you look at these other forms of ethics, and as you look at the sort of traditional views of ethics that people have talked about down through the ages, don't forget that there are qualities that sometimes these leave out. And those qualities are exhibited more from a feminine perspective than they are from a masculine perspective. Anyway, we'll look at that as well, and sort of as a supplement or a caveat to the whole of ethics. We will see those after we look at virtue ethics as well. So that's our roadmap for ethical theories. And as we continue throughout this course, it may be helpful to keep this as a reference up in the front of your notes or something like that, so you can refer back to it from time to time to know where you're at as we study through these various ethical theories. We'll go into depth on each one of them a little bit more. We'll talk about some of the good things about them, some of the bad things about them, some critiques of them, and so forth. So, but do keep this in mind, and I think it'll be a helpful tool for you to use as a reference. All right, well, thank you very much. We'll see you in the next video.